Hello, this is John Jughead at 2:24 a.m. in the morning in Japan, Osaka. Um, I thought I had finished up my thoughts on the time period between Bugada and My Brain Hurts, but a few other things had come up, and people showed a little bit interest in knowing about I Want to Be a Homosexual, and that sort of fell in that same time period that I was going to touch on the last YouTube recording, but it didn't seem to come up in my sort of spontaneous reacting to that time period and the Punk House EP. So this is one that's not specifically about an EP. It's about a series of songs that we recorded in, must have been around '89 in California at a place called, let's get it right now, this time around. It took me a while to try to find it. It's at Sergey's Recording Emporium in Berkeley, California, engineered by Alex Sergey. And then I was talking to Larry Livermore, who started Lookout Records, trying to find out the name of this place because I knew we had recorded with Vermin somewhere in California, um, but it never came out on a single, EP or record. But all the songs were pretty popular songs for us. So it was kind of strange that it sort of escaped me and Larry's memory, and also Vapid's, of where this was. But it was a little studio that I guess Larry also, he wrote back and said, "Ah, yes, good old Alex Sergey in his backyard studio!" Exclamation point. The Lookouts recorded there as well, probably around the same time. So for some reason we forgot about it. I think it was probably just a short-termed studio. Um, but it was recorded on what I always refer to. It's a lot of my book is about it, which is called the Malibu tour, um, and why we ended up traveling in Ben's Chevy Malibu. I think is actually a fairly interesting story. Um, it was Vermin, me, Vapid, and Ben, and we were going to go on a pretty major tour, and we were going to play again in at Gilman Street. That was one of the goals, was to get there. But then we traveled, I think, all the way up to that area, almost straight there, because I remember our we had a flat tire on our way to. That's what it was. We had a flat tire on our way to. I think it was Oregon. Yes, and we actually brought the tire with us on stage when we got there because we got to the show almost right before we had to go on. I think that was in Oregon, probably. I think that was our first show. We went all the way from Chicago to Oregon, and then we traveled all the way down through California, and I think through Texas, which had a lot of crazy drives. We couldn't get. I was booking a lot of the gigs at the time, and we couldn't get what you had to do when you were in a band back then, and you know, in the punk, there wasn't a real punk circuit back then. We were just playing VFW halls in people's basements, but you couldn't get them all to line up, so you'd often have to travel past where you had played, two nights a night before on your way to another gig. And in Texas, that's pretty major. You ended up having like 7 hour drives and then back 8 hours, constantly going past where we had already played, just because we couldn't get the shows to fit in order, and we were pretty wasted, tired by the end of that tour. We did a lot of driving. Me and Ben did most of it because we found out that Vermin had lied and that he wasn't actually old enough to drive, so he didn't have a license. And Vapid Ben didn't actually like Vapid's driving because he would sort of veer off the road sometimes, and the tires would hit on that side thing like dunk 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 dunk. And Ben already had enough anxiety about being on the road, so it was mostly me and Ben doing most of the driving on that tour. But the reason we ended up in the Chevy Malibu was that we had been saving our money, Ben and I, jobs that we had been doing. I think I was at the movie theater probably then still. Yeah, I was probably at the movie theater. And Ben, well, we also had another job working for my My brother had a job where his company made metal piping. I think that went underground. I don't know what was for gas or for water or something. But Ben and I's job was to take these big, huge metal pipes and to sand off all of the aluminum shards on the ends of the tubes. And we used to get up like at 6 in the morning to go to this job. And I would come home with, even though we had masks on, I would come home with metal shards all over in my skin. And if you were accidentally like rub your face, you would get these, the shards would cut into your skin and you'd start bleeding. So that was a pretty horrible job. But we did this job to help raise the money for this tour. I think Ben might have been living in Doug Ward's at that time. I seem to remember leaving from his place on one of these tours, and this might be the one. But anyway, the idea was to purchase a van, but we didn't have a lot of money, and I remember we searched all around Chicago and the northwest suburbs, and we couldn't find anything. And then we eventually drove to maybe Wisconsin to pick up the van that was this van that was pretty cheap. And we went with, I remember it was, maybe it was all of us, but I know Vapid was there and I was there and Ben at least. Vermin might have been there too, but I can't recall. But we all drove to this place and paid for the van, and then I had to end up driving it back. And the whole time the van was smoking. It was already a bad purchase, but we just didn't know what we were doing, and I think we were leaving for a tour in a few days, and we didn't have anything to travel in, so we bought it, and I remember oil like bubbling up and the smell of oil in the van, and we got to this toll booth, and I didn't have any money, and and I was yelling at Ben and Dan to try to pay for me, and then I had to go through the toll booth and talk my way out of paying the toll in this smoking van. But we got to my house and parked the van in the driveway, and that's the last time that van moved on its own. It sat in my driveway for the next couple of days before we left on tour. We had to have actually one of those companies where you pay them 50, or they pay you $50 to use your car for pieces. So I don't know what we paid for the thing, but we ended up selling it for $50 a couple of days later. And then the next idea was, well, I guess we're going to be stuck in Ben's Chevy Malibu, so why don't we get one of those trailers? We'll rent a trailer and hook it up to the back of it. So we actually installed. Me and Ben went and bought one of those things that you put on your fenders so that you could hook up a trailer to it. So we paid for that thing. We put it on, and I can't recall why, but we ended up, I think we ran into another band that had a trailer like that, and we heard all these horror stories of how going through the mountains it had been hard to control. And I think we just didn't have enough money at the time to purchase that and also take the chance of it crashing with all of our merch and guitars in it. So we ended up doing the whole tour. It was like a 4-week tour. I always say it was 10,000 miles. I still remember that because from that day I used to always say the 10,000 mile tour. We went around the country in the Chevy Malibu. We traveled without amps, so it was just our guitars and I think Vermin's maybe snare drum, and we put all of the stuff into a little camper thing that went on top of the Chevy Malibu. So we traveled around the country that way. It was pretty stuffy in there, and I remember it was so crowded, but yet Ben saw these two hitchhikers on the side of the road. I don't know. We were somewhere I don't know, somewhere in like Iowa or maybe farther. I think we were farther west. But he even said it was like, well, the stupidest idea, but well, let's pick these people up. And we did. So we ended up having 4, 5, 6 people in the Chevy Malibu with the drums and the guitars and all of our shirts, merch and stuff, all stuck into this Chevy Malibu all the way to, I don't know where we took them to. I'm getting this mixed up with whether this was a tour we drove straight to Seattle or we went to California. Um, but that was crazy. Um, and the songs that we recorded on this tour that I just figured out with Larry and Vapid. Well, I knew the songs, but I didn't know where. But we recorded I Want to Be Homosexual, the first version of it, Slogans, and also Kamala's Too Nice. We might Kamala's Too Nice might have actually have been written on the road. I think Vapid and Ben worked on that. I think when we were in Olympia, maybe. I think we stayed in Olympia and they were working on a song around a campfire. I even remember little traces of guest list before it was a song. I think Ben or Vapid was sort of playing with that. But we went into the studio and recorded just those three songs. Two of them were for David Hayes, who worked with Larry in those days, Larry Livermore, um, for his label, and that was an EP called "What Are You Pointing At?" So on that was "I Want to Be Homosexual" and "Kamala's Too Nice," and then we saved slogans for another compilation called what? "A Fungus Among Us," which is a lot like uh, the Adrenaline OD song, "A Humongous Fungus Among Us." This was "There Is a Fungus Among Us," I think, which had also Bhopal Stiffs and a band called the Vernicious Knids, which is pretty funny because that's actually the band that Vinny was in with Glenn from Impulse Manslaughter before Vinny actually became part of Impulse Manslaughter. I don't think, yeah. So that was a little bit uncomfortable being on that EP with them. So the songs individually, what I'd like to say about them, then maybe I won't talk about them as much on My Brain Hurts because two of them ended up on there. I think I'll tackle first Slogans, which is one of my most favorite songs. Um, was a little bit about at the time we had a lot of run-ins with the Chicago skinheads who were, there was Nazi skinheads, and my friend made a reference on the comments of one of the YouTube videos about how at Doug Ward's he met, or Dave Best, he met the black Nazi skinhead, and that was true. We had a black Nazi skinhead in Chicago. It was one of the strangest, bizarre things that what was he thinking to be in a group of people that are the exact people that would turn on him, if they were actually pushed to it, and he'd be, strung up if that type of stuff were to be heated up in that direction in that group that he belonged to. But anyway, of course, back in those days when we were doing shows, we were our dress code. There really wasn't one. We used to just I liked putting on whatever I found at thrift stores, and we were kind of goofy. And Ben was into wearing like pink leotards and getting naked on stage and drawing stuff on himself. So it was a lot of fun and goofy stuff. And we sort of reacted harshly to the sort of skinheads' specific attire. The Doc Martens and the bald heads and the sort of army clothes. And the song Slogans was sort of related to that sort of mentality. And also at the time they had put in Chicago, the skinheads had put out a death warrant for Ben, so that was pretty extreme. It was laughable, but also I think we were also just ever slightly so put off by that, a little worried about it, but nothing ever came of that. So that was Slogans, and then the other Kamala was. I think this is how it went down. I was trying to piece this together, but with Larry's help. We stayed at Matt Freeman's from Operation Ivy and from Rancid. We stayed at their house with Lint, who lived there. His name was Lint at the time. That's Tim Armstrong. And we became pretty good friends with them, and they let us stay with us. And Kamala had come over. She used to book shows and things, and I think Ben may have stayed over at Kamala's. I'm not sure, but the rest of us were at Lint and Matt's place, and that I remember was the first time that I had ever seen an acoustic bass. we didn't know a lot about instruments back then, or I didn't, and Matt Freeman brought out this acoustic bass, and I fell in love with the instruments right then, and I knew eventually someday I would start some sort of band. Uh, like when I started Even In Blackouts, that was pretty one of the images in my head was Matt Freeman playing that acoustic bass. Um, and it's kind of funny how much I was affected by that sort of stay there because um, I had always been uncomfortable and a very tense guitar player, and having watched Tim Armstrong play at ease, he didn't play the split leg style or anything like that, but he played very low, and the guitar, his strap was really long, and he just was sort of wandered the stage with ease. He was a left-handed guitarist, so I couldn't actually play his guitar, but it was important to me after having seen him on stage to try to loosen up myself. And so my way of playing low to the ground was to sort of, to make extreme the Ramones sort of stance, but take it to an extreme, crazy, absurd level, and play it so low that the guitar was almost touching the ground. And I found out that I could actually play better that way. So I loosened up a lot my playing from experiencing staying with Matt and Tim Armstrong. But so that song was about. So Kamala helped us out a lot, and I think she might even have set that up as us staying there. And they had a sort of a good rapport. Like Ben and Kamala were really good at sort of you know casting insults at each other, from what I recall. So that song was written about Kamala, an actual Kamala. And the last one on there that is one of our all-time well-known songs, "I Want to Be Homosexual." Um, I also wanted to say on these that my goal isn't to analyze lyrics, not until we get until Even Blackouts, where I can rightfully talk about lyrics because I wrote them. I don't really like the idea of putting words into Ben's mouth as to what he was writing about at the time. Um, Early on, we used to talk a lot more about lyrics, but this is about the time where it sort of changed, and he was consulting Vapid more, and so I just don't even feel right talking about where his ideas came from. I do know that around this time, um, oh no, I just forgot their name now. Around this time, why am I keep on forgetting their name? I'm gonna look this up. But there was a band that did Indiana punk bands. I was just looked them up just a moment ago, and I forgot their name again. Sloppy Seconds, of course, put out in '89 an album called Destroyed that had "I Don't Want to Be a Homosexual," and I think Ben immediately responded to that with the "I Want to Be a Homosexual." In the beginning of the song, this was in Vermin's basement, and another thing is that his mom used to bring us cookies, and I think she would just bring us nice little desserts every once in a while, and sometimes we would go up into the living room and venture up into the house. She was always pretty great to us, so that was a good memory of being in that basement. And some people, uh, used to come visit us while we were playing. And Brian's brother was a pretty cool guy, and even Vapid's brother would come over sometimes, and we'd have a good time in that basement. But it was also very conducive for Vapid and me, and Ben was still in a more playful sort of period, I think, where he it wasn't as sick and tired of being around musicians playing as much as he got. Like he would just kind of bring in songs and not want to be there as much at rehearsal. But this time he was it felt more like a band, and so it allowed me and Vap to sort of come up with this beginning part for "I Want to Be Homosexual." I think Ben wanted something in sort of an instrumental lead into it, and so me and Vap had sort of started creating stuff. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's actually Ben playing the solo on top of it. It's not me. Mine is the sort of single note chord stuff that I'm doing underneath it, that I always like doing. It sort of sits in the back of a lot of Weasel songs and goes unappreciated, but I really like that sort of stuff. Slogans has that too. It sounds like straight chords, but there's actually a little hammering and peeling that I'm doing on the chord changes, and I can hear it. So that's, yeah. I don't really want to, the topic of it's, Ben had gay friends, I had gay friends, um, and in the scene, it was a little bit more acceptable to poke fun at that in order to bring out the actual homophobes. The queers sort of played with that too, and probably I imagine Ben was sort of inspired by that too, to sort of poke at the people that the skinheads, of course, who are very anti-gay. Uh, at least the ones during that time period. A lot of them were, especially the Nazi skinheads, of course. Um, so that playing that song and would get us into a lot of trouble in those days. But the fact that it was accepted by the growing gay culture in the punk scene back then, to me, sort of supported the idea that they got it. They got that we were we were we were making a comment about the homophobics and not any sort of bashing of homosexuality. Um, I don't know. I think that's it. That's the three. I may tackle a little bit more on slogans when it comes up on My Brain Hurts. But this was just supposed to be a short one to bring us back to that period and to talk a little bit about that Malibu tour that was just crazy, crazy. It was us in that Malibu for 10,000 miles. Um, I went sleepless nights. Oh, one last story I'll tell that it was supposed to be in the book and it never made it in. Is that we were in Texas and I had like a 7 hour drive and we left right after a show and I was driving and we started singing 100 bottles of beer on the wall, but we made it I think 1,000 or something like that, and it was just crazy. It went on for like an hour, and we were all singing in different harmonies. It was pretty great, the four of us all singing along. And then eventually everyone fell asleep, and I was left driving. And somehow I veered off the road, not falling asleep, but there was maybe like an emergency sign or one of those, the emergency horses in the road. So I went off the ramp, and I couldn't get back on, and I was embarrassed to wake anybody else up to help me. Because we had a gig, the next day, and we were going to be driving all night. So I actually wandered around this little town in Texas, probably for like an hour and a half, just completely lost, going, "Where the fuck am I? I'm not going to wake anybody up. They're just going to yell at me if they know." And then eventually, I got without stopping. Even the gas stations were closed. It was just dead out there, hardly any lights. And eventually, I got back on the road, and they never knew anything about it. It just took a little bit longer than we thought to get to our next venue. Uh, so that's what I would like to say for tonight. Um, and now the next one, I will get back to my regularly scheduled program of doing My Brain Hurts, which I will take a couple days to think about. So thanks everybody for uh, for listening to these. It actually means a lot to me. So thank you and good day to you.